Well, we're delighted today to have before us retired U.S. Air Force General Frank Gorenc. General Gorenc retired from the Air Force after 37 years and 4 months of service on October 1st, 2016. General Gorenc has had a very distinguished career in the U.S. Air Force, but I think his own personal story about his family with the roots in the Balkans and how his family moved to the United States, I believe it was in 1964, 62. That story about how his family came here, he grew up in Wisconsin. He has a brother that served in the Air Force, and that he was, when the brother was at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Frank went to visit him, and he was inspired from that day forward to want to serve in the U.S. Air Force. I think the great story about his family and rising through the ranks is typical of American immigrant families that come to the United States and succeed. Today, one of our analysts was here today, and originally from Kaliningrad, and Sergey was commenting about how much of an inspiration that is to him and others. When I was preparing for my presentation to introduce General Gorenc, I was introduced to him through our good friend, mutual friend, General Phil Breedlove. And when I was trying to ask about some things to describe General Gorenc, General Breedlove corrected me, and when I was talking about being a pilot, and he says, Glenn, one thing you need to emphasize about Frank Gorenc is that he was an F-15 pilot, not an F-16 pilot. And so when I started digging around to bolster my own knowledge about the difference between the two, one of the things I learned is that the F-15 has 4 times the range of an F-16, and it flies at a higher altitude. So General Gorenc has had the luxury of flying at a higher altitude, and so we, through his position, commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe, he's had an ability to see a lot of things going on related to Russia, but he's also was in Iraq and has had an experience of also out-of-area operations, of understanding kind of what how Russia's been operating and what does that bring to the United States. And we asked him today to talk about the challenge of Russian air operations in Syria. And that is what he's going to talk about, and I think that he will be sharing his thoughts and assessments of Russian air operations. We gave him a long list of questions before this conference. Steve Blank and I and Ted put some questions to him about things we'd like him to address, and I think he's from my preliminary conversations with him, that he is prepared to do that. We have the great honor today to have him here, and he's now retired and can speak frankly, and that's why we will benefit from his insights. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate it. Thank you for all of you for coming, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And given the subject of my briefing, I tried to create a briefing that would inspire questions, and so there'll be plenty of time for that in the end. But I wanted to offer up a couple of preliminary thoughts with respect to this topic, and I want to start out with a little bit of a refresher, I think, for all of us with respect to Russia, because in the end, with the Russians, what's old is new, and I think that, Churchill said it best, when he said, Russia's a riddle wrapped in a mystery in an enigma. And obviously that describes a place that's hard to figure out. It describes a country that has one foot in Europe and one foot in Asia, and that struggle that they've had along the way with that, is reflected in the views of their leadership, whether it's a czar or whether it's a communist, Marxist-Leninist, or it's whatever you consider President Putin to be today. But in the end, they do, in my view, have an eye towards Europe, and their leadership reinforced that really from the very beginning. I mean, it was Peter the Great, in the 1600s. Basically, his aim was to, quote, sever all the people from their former Asiatic customs and instruct them how all Christian peoples in Europe comport themselves, which is an interesting view. That was reinforced 100 years later with Catherine the Great, who basically just said Russia is a European state. And that state is defined by a proclivity to go through these cycles that Kissinger describes as a rhythm. And that's basically expansion, interrupted occasionally for a time by the need to adjust its domestic structure to the vastness of the enterprise. And that is consistent, and I think it's what's happening today, and it really defines the way that President Putin operates and his view on the near abroad. And that view is obviously flavored with a good dose of paranoia and power. And so I think it'd be worthwhile to go to the real root of that discussion. In the mid-17th century, the foreign minister for Tsar Alexei was asked to define what the foreign policy was, and it was expanding the state in every direction. And, there was one of the journalists here tried to describe the view of the Russian ambassador in 1903. And basically his quote was, "All Russians seem fixed on a single idea that Russia must by her irresistible inertia crush whatever stood in her way." And that theme is pretty consistent. And of course, the best analysis I still think today of the Russian mindset is Kennan in the Long Telegram. And it's always worthwhile taking a look at that to kind of define the way, that the Russians would act. And in his telegram, he said, "The bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is traditional instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Soviet power was impervious to the reason of logic. It was highly sensitive to the logic of force." So I think that's a good backdrop to describe the leadership. And then, of course, whoever the leader is of Russia, there's a proclivity there to make it, about that person. It was true with the czars, which was described as the living icon of God. Sovereign is the living law. And Catherine the Great said that Russia had to be ruled by an absolute power, and the embodiment of the defense of Russia against enemies surrounding it on all sides was at the time the Tsar, but I think that's continued pretty much through their whole thing. And so, and then it's all flavored by this idea that the Russian, the brooding, expansive Russian soul that everybody tries to analyze, which is interesting. And I think you just need to deal with it. But, again, I go back to my favorite quick read on all of this, which is, Secretary Kissinger in his book, World Order. It's kind of fun to read that every once in a while. He says that the Russians came to see itself as beleaguered outpost of civilization for which security can only be found through exerting its absolute will over its neighbors. It was permanently in the grip of conflating temptation and fear. Based on the Russian experience, ultimately based on stoic endurance. This is the idea that the Russian population is willing to endure anything in order to advance, the Russian state. And so I wanted to go through that history lesson because I think it really flavors kind of what's going on today. And in Europe, we used to have, fun, trying to figure out where President Putin was. And it really came down to two camps. He's either a strategic genius or it's like dealing with a pigeon playing chess. Knocks over all the pieces, craps all over the board, and then struts around like they're victorious. And so I share that kind of fun, comment because the truth is somewhere in between. And, I've come to believe that there are many foreign leaders that know the West better than the West knows themselves. And I think that's kind of where we are, and I think it's important to think about that. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is this concept of offset. Who here has heard about the third offset? Okay, I think this is really important because every offset, an offset is defined as a capability that gives the West asymmetric military advantage. And we've been through two of those cycles. The last administration talked about the third offset. This administration said you can't talk about an offset like that. Whatever. The bottom line is it happened. In the 50s was the first offset. This is where we were conventionally weak. And so the offset that we chose to pursue was nuclear weapons in all forms. And of course, we did a pretty good job with that. Went through the whole, Cold War, all that. We went through it. The next offset came in the 70s. The reason it came in the 70s was by that time, the Russians had pretty much achieved nuclear parity with us. And so we explored more nuclear kind of asymmetric advantage. For those of us that are old enough, we had a pretty big discussion about the neutron bomb and high altitude electromagnetic pulse and all that stuff. But we decided we didn't want to do that. And we pursued the technology that basically gave us a conventional advantage in the form of stealth, microelectronics, precision-guided munitions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we committed to, and that was, and quite honestly, are still the fruit of what we're enjoying right now with respect to an asymmetric advantage. But the previous administration started talking about how do we get that asymmetric advantage, that third offset for the next round of security and stability in the world. And we're still arguing about exactly what that is, but you hear about it in the news with respect to space, cyber, ballistic missiles, the ability to deliver nukes on ballistic missiles, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the kind of things that are being explored. And I could talk about this topic all day long, but offsets, every 3 decades, we need an offset. And that's kind of where we are. And once I start talking about Syria, you'll understand why. The bottom line is today Russia is caught up. So what's different about today's environment and today's offset? There's a whole list. There's hybrid warfare, there's non-state actors, there's space, there's cyber, ballistic missiles, nuke proliferation, and the stated desire to go to commercial R&D to find whatever that is. And I'll leave it at that, and you can ask questions about it. But this offset issue is very important. Then the other thing I want to mention is change is always a constant. And I'll use my career as a backdrop to describe change in the security environment and in particular military force. I like to say that I've served in 4 different air forces caused by 3 different collapses. I came in the military right into the Cold War Air Force. 10 years after I came into the military, something miraculous happened. We won the Cold War. And the symbol of that was the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Of course, that bipolar world falling apart created vacuums, which was filled roughly 2 years later in the form of one of our allies who basically said, hey, by the way, I think Kuwait is the 19th province of Iraq. You know the rest of the story. That spawned into the next Air Force that I worked in, and that was the no-fly zone Air Force. And I love the no-fly zone Air Force. I love the Cold War Air Force. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. And I worked in that no-fly zone Air Force until the second collapse came, and that was the collapse of the Twin Towers. All of a sudden, that Air Force that I was in was thrust into the global war on terror Air Force. I like to call it that. It looked like the no-fly zone Air Force, except we shut down a bunch of bases that we had to now open back up in an expeditionary way because we closed everything. And so we started into the Global War on Terror Air Force. And I love the Global War on Terror Air Force. It was fantastic. We did a great job of adjusting it to it, just like the Army did. And then in 2007, our friends in Wall Street created high quality bonds out of junk mortgages, right? You remember that story? That was the third collapse, the collapse of Wall Street. This country almost went bankrupt during that time. And that spawned the fourth kind of Air Force that I operated in, and I call it the Global War on Terror Air Force under severe fiscal austerity. And we had to make some huge adjustments to the way that we operated, and we've done a really good job. The question that I pose to all of you is, what's the next collapse? It's coming. I think we're in the middle of it. If you have a question or you have some knowledge on what it is, let me know, because we didn't do a good job of predicting the other ones either. But in the end, our Air Force had to provide exactly what we always provide: air superiority, strike capability, mobility, ISR, and then the command and control to put it together, which is relevant for the discussion on how the Russians are doing in Syria. Okay, so keep that in mind. I promise you we'll get to Syria here in just a second. And then finally, I just want to set up this discussion by saying Russian actions speak louder than words. Okay, the reality is Russia is a relatively weak nation in decline, and in their zeal to gain and maintain influence and expand, they're directly challenging the, quote, international world order, the one that we all have come to admire, and the one that we're talking about even today as we try to figure out what these international organizations are doing for us, et cetera, et cetera. I think that was part of the plan, but we'll get to that later. Now, manipulating, and let me throw this number out just to have you think about this. It's amazing that Russia, a declining nation, has so much influence in the world, given this fact. Do you know what the combined GDP of the NATO countries is? $36 trillion. That's 36 with 12 zeros after it. You know what the combined GDP of Russia is? $1.5 trillion. We have two states that have a GDP bigger than Russia. And yet you would think we're in a bipolar world. So I want to throw that out. I'd love to hear what you think about that. But I believe that Russia, better than any nation in the world, uses the elements of national power better than anyone. And on top of that, they know exactly how any Western nation is going to use it. Who's here familiar with the dime? Okay, diplomacy, information, military, economic. The three elements of national power that we never talk about are location, resources, and population. I bring that up because Russia hasn't moved, it only got smaller. The population is declining, just like every other European nation is. The average lifespan of a Russian male is 60 years old. Resources, I mean, we can argue about this, but we talked a lot about gas last panel. Guess what their whole economy is based on? It's a single commodity economy of $1.5 trillion. Now, the dime is interesting because I think President Putin is very good at using the dime, but he uses it in a way that basically is designed to amplify their strength and minimize their weakness. In the meantime, he's working against an adversary that says, I'm going to do diplomacy, then I'm going to do information, then I'm going to do economic sanctions, and then at the end, and only at the end, will we use economic power. The manipulation of the dime in a way that creates advantage is what we call hybrid warfare, I would argue. And I hope that inspires some questions. Behind this is a weak nation that freely talks about the limited use of nuclear weapon in response to a conventional reinforcement of NATO if we had an Article 5. Who does that? The Russians do it. That's why they're so powerful in the eyes of the leadership over there. In the meantime, there's been a creation, and I call it the Iron Curtain of A2AD environments. From the Barents to the Baltics to the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea is a proliferating expansion and an attempt to deny access and deny area to anybody but themselves. That A2AD environment in Kaliningrad, like my good friend from Kaliningrad knows, spills over into 1/3 of Poland and the majority of the Baltic nations. That's not an accident. Okay, that's how you display power when you really don't have any, in my view. So there's the A2 and the AD environments. And then, of course, you have a whole web of frozen conflicts that are basically remnants of the Russians all over Europe. If you don't know what a frozen conflict is when the military actions are over, there's no peace treaty, there's no political framework that is in place that's acceptable to any of the combatants. The list is long, and it's growing, and now it includes Syria, NK, Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk. There's others in the world, but these are the ones that are just Russian-inspired. Now, back to Syria. So, actions speak louder than words. I have a list of things that I'm going to just throw out there, and if you have any questions. First and foremost, I think the most important thing about Syria is it demonstrated the Russian ability and willingness to deploy and employ an expeditionary force, which has not happened for a long time, and it was a gift provided by the lack of the West meeting stated red lines. Didn't cost a lot, but gives the impression that there's real power there. But their willingness to do it says a lot, because I know that projecting power is not an easy task, and projecting power is very, very expensive. They demonstrated an increased capability since the disastrous 2007 5-day Georgia conflict, which they, I guess, created a frozen conflict. But the performance of their Air Force was an absolute disaster. They lost 4 airplanes in 5 days. That's by they admitted they lost 4 airplanes in 5 days, but other sources say it was a lot more significant than that. Okay? They demonstrate an increased capacity. They're still there. They're still flying sorties. They displayed increased readiness, or readiness that we didn't think that they had, but they did. They demonstrated their ability to rapidly deploy air defense systems, which is not an easy task to do. The S-300 and the S-400 are inside of that demonstration. They demonstrated their ability to fly long-range bomber missions, strategic bombers doing tactical bombing. It looked more like Linebacker 2 of Vietnam than it did what we did with the bombers in Afghanistan, But they did it nonetheless. They demonstrated their ability to fire cruise missiles from surface vessels, submerged subs, and aircraft. And some of those missiles flew a long way, and it's pretty clear to me that they were eager to demonstrate their ability to do that. They demonstrated the ability to execute combined arms with coalition partners. That's not easy to do, but they did it. Many analysts in this area give the Russian Air Force and the sorties they provided, the credit for providing and turning what was a defensive situation for that government into an offensive situation. And it proves again that air power is very important to the combined joint fight. They deployed their first fifth-generation fighter, their Su-57. It was kind of a short deployment, and then just recently they canceled the program. So I don't know what they proved there, but the bottom line is the fact that they sent that airplane over was yet another display that they're an equal partner with equal capabilities inside on the world stage. They deployed an aircraft carrier and flew sorties from that aircraft carrier along with the task force out of the Med. This was an interesting deployment. Of course, they don't have carriers like we do, but they have jump jet. It's relatively jump jets on there. It's a relatively small air group of approximately 12 airplanes. The MiG-29, which is the most capable airplane that was on that deck, quite honestly had difficulties, even though it had the best capability to support ground operations. The Su-33, which was the other 8 airplanes on that deck, is primarily a fleet air defense aircraft, so it had limited capability to support the warfight. But in the end, they did use it. But what they found was carrier ops are pretty hard to do, particularly if you don't do it a lot. And if you don't have catapults and you don't have arresting gear, it can be pretty tough to do. In fact, they lost a MiG-29 that had an engine failure, but the cables weren't ready to land. They weren't ready to use the cables. And then on the Su-33 also crashed. So they lost 2 airplanes in a relatively short deployment of that carrier. And that carrier battle group was an interesting display of power, but the real combat power coming off of that task force was actually not as significant as you would think. And then they also deployed aircraft using aircraft dedicated to electronic countermeasures. Now, there's good news and there's bad news about this list. I was in Europe as the commander when all of this was happening, and I was absolutely thrilled to see what they were showing us. They were eager to show us. We were eager to evaluate. It looked like a lot of the capabilities they brought to bear were simply ways to test to see if the stuff worked. So it was like a test range. And some of it worked and some of it didn't. But to see them do the expeditionary operations and to see them accept the cost of those expeditionary operations, we'll see how long it goes, and we'll see what the results are. But I think that Syria, like the rest of the frozen conflicts, will become frozen conflicts for a long time. And then I want to end real quick with a couple of things. I think that to deal with the Russians, given their history, to deal with the Russians, given our role, I think we need to continue inside of NATO, which is the most successful military political alliance in the history of the world. We have to accept a few realities. The first one is the power reality. NATO potential power is not real power. If we have $36 trillion and we're not buying the right stuff and then creating units and power that is actually ready to execute, it's just $36 trillion. Don't be confused by that. That's where the real crux of the biscuit is. There's a transition reality. When deterrence fails inside of NATO, prompt consensus is pivotal and collective defense must be decisive. Just for a poll, how many Article 5 responses have there been in NATO? 1. It was the response to when the United States was attacked by the terrorists. So I'll say good on NATO for doing that, but the reality is that NATO has yet to be tested with a real Article 5 response that could result in a collective defense. So we're in unexplored territory there. And a lot of the discussion that's happened with the summits lately is all about that readiness of the force, which is a threat reality. The enemy has a vote and could choose war. We may not want to fight it, but they could choose it for whatever reason. That hasn't happened yet, but when it does, it will be a test of the alliance, for sure. And if the alliance doesn't respond with an Article 5 ready to go to collective defense, I think NATO is in jeopardy. And then finally, there's a force reality. NATO forces have to be ready, deployable, and sustainable to be fully combat capable. So the question is, ready for what? Deployable to where? And sustainable for how long? With enough money, I can buy sustainability. I can buy readiness. But clearly in the discussions that we're having right now, you know, that this 2%, the 2% goal, which the NATO countries established during the Wales Summit. The one that we don't talk about that was also in the Wales Summit is 20% of that 2% is supposed to go to modernization. So that's as uneven as the 2%. $36 trillion GDP, 5 of 29 of those countries are at 2%. My last count was 10 of those 29 have met the 20% modernization goal. And so I'll close with that. And I will say that my eyes and ears perked up as I watched the Syrians or watched the Russians execute in Syria. And it should make everybody concerned about the capabilities that they have been able to bring to bear in that area. I'll be perfectly honest. I've been in this business for a long time. I sleep perfectly fine at night, even with their improvements. But the question will and always will be, do we have the willingness to respond to an adversary that's operating below the threshold? I don't know what the answer is to that. Everybody's got an opinion. I'm happy to hear them. And so with that, I think I'll close and answer any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to call on some people here real quick, but I want to use the luxury of my chair here to ask you a question, and that is, does the Russian military have the capabilities to do another out-of-area operation like they are in Syria simultaneously, or is Syria too much of a drain on the resources, you think, to be able to do anything beyond that in another theater?
I'll answer that with a resounding, I really don't know. I think they could muster it up. The question is, how long could they do it? And my sense of things is that they have enough on their plate right now in all the places that they're at. But it's possible.
Is the shortage of pilots rumor, is that true?
I have not heard that specifically. But I would imagine if they're like every other country in NATO, there's a shortage of pilots everywhere.
Even in the U.S.?
Particularly in the U.S. And I think we're all working real hard to solve that problem, but obviously that's a major commitment and a major cost.
Okay, we have a question. This lady here was the first one up. Then we'll go to Mark, Sergey, and then work our way to the back here. So.
Thanks, General, for your presentation. You mentioned a lot, but on the other hand, I also want to see what you think about it. Of the trend is some kind of, or need is more exploration. Supposedly, you said you have seen a collapse, and I think those 3 collapses happen to be in the Republican administration. So I just saw if Republican administration doing this way, But then why there is some kind of contradictory? Now we want to say build a wall instead of tear down the Berlin Wall. See, and you say the population, if it's declining, just like China, they are now declining, so they want to have a 2-children policy now. So if that's the case, why we don't accept the immigration instead of deportation? And another thing.
Let's limit to one question because we have other people
because I'm
waiting.
thinking it's a system
But
problem.
I think your question is outside of what this discussion is about. We're not here to talk about immigration.
But we are talking population. I try to see whether there's some kind of policy that can implement better rather than contradictory one generation after another.
Yeah, I get you. I don't have a direct answer to your question. I don't know if any of those collapses, I describe them as collapses just because it's convenient to say, but I don't know if they're inspired by the conservatives or whatever. I mean, this is clearly, out of my lane. What I was just trying to describe is I was in the Air Force for 37 years. And in the end, our Air Force had to adjust to 4 different security environments while we were trying to provide the same capability for the political leadership of our country to use in whatever way they want to. And I worked really hard, not to, the bottom line is, as a military person, I just try to follow what the leadership of our country and the American people want to do with that military. And so immigration, I think, as we've probably found out, and this is where immigration does connect with Putin. The reality is because of that intervention in Syria, 5 million people were put on the road. They literally walked from Syria to Europe. Was that the right thing to do? You don't have to answer that. I really don't care. But the problem is now there's a mass immigration walking across. There's 9 million people that are displaced inside the country. The chances of that country rebuilding with the talent that's available there is limited. And then, of course, there's the standard migration that comes out of Africa. So to your point, I think immigration is a security issue.
Thank you. Mark?
General, thank you so very much. Mark Katz again from George Mason University. Certainly reading an awful lot of Russian commentary on the things that you talk about, that there is a sense of triumphalism, that they're doing well in Europe, they're doing well in the Middle East, they're even doing well here. But that what it always seems to end up with is that with Russian pessimism. So at the end of the day, their big challenge is China, and they're doing nothing about that. And it seems that it is sort of a conundrum. If one is as risk averse as Putin, seeing enemies everywhere, why is it that they don't seem to take this Chinese threat, seriously? If my neighbor was the world's most populous country and it was getting stronger economically and militarily, I'd be worried about it. Is it sort of a head in the sand? Or do they feel that if and when China is a threat to Russia, it'll also be a threat to the West, and therefore the West will help Russia because it'll be in its interests? To me, it's just a real question mark as to what explains their attitude toward China, when it seems that, at least in my view, that ought to be considered at least a possible threat to them. Thank you.
I'm not qualified to answer that question, but I do think that it's a good one. And what I'm really excited about is the new National Defense Strategy. Who here has read it? I love it. Finally, there's a document that describes the common view of what the security situation is. Now, we all will disagree or agree on the content of it, but the focus provided by that document is providing impetus for a real discussion on how we move forward to achieve the vision of this country. And that vision, that strategy is really allowing the discussion with respect to how big should the Army be, what kind of equipment should they have, et cetera, et cetera. It's providing a focus that up to this point we haven't had. Because let's face it, until recently, we've had a strategy that was fiscally constrained, strategically informed. By any definition of the word strategy, it was weak in my view. But this document is exciting. That combined with the nuclear posture review, I think was an important document. The national security strategy is an important document that weaves in all of the elements of national power. And so, and I think they're all good for one reason and one reason alone, because it brings together a common vision, whether you agree or disagree, so that we can have informed discussions on where we should go and the decisions we should make with respect to organize, training, equipping, deploying, and employing that force in conjunction with our coalition partners.
You, sir, and go ahead, sir.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were in line. You're next, sir.
General, thank you very much for your presentation. Really interesting. As a person who is extensively writing about Kaliningrad, I would like to ask you many questions, but since we don't have time, I will reduce this to just a single question. Russian military strategy does not have this concept A2AD strategy, but it is implementing this at least in Kaliningrad. And Russia's actions in building an A2AD bubble in Kaliningrad, it consists of two pillars, a military pillar and non-military pillar. And in your view, which pillar is more formidable, the non-military pillar or the military? Thank you very much. And thank you especially for bringing attention to the lessons of history.
Yeah. Well, in my view, for the people in this room, you should all take a look at Kaliningrad, because Kaliningrad is the best defended piece of airspace in the world. It's layered, and it's chock full of mobile systems that are very hard to target, that would be a very hard nut to crack if, in fact, we had to do it. Now, the reason that Kaliningrad is important is because obviously it is Russia. For those of you that don't know, it's not a frozen conflict. It's actually Russia, the motherland. And the bottom line is, given the nervousness of our Baltic brothers and our Polish brothers, the bottom line is, I think that's the most important thing for now, military-wise, because in the end, it threatens the decision that would be required to reinforce the Baltics if something happened there. Because remember, NATO is all about getting consensus, which is not a fast process. And then you have to move force to the place you're protecting if it was going to be a full-up conflict. And the A2AD environment in Kaliningrad is a formidable obstacle to overcome, even if the decision was made on time or fast.
Yes, this gentleman's been waiting.
Roy Gutman, I'm a journalist, Daily Beast and Frontline. I wonder if you could, and I've been covering Syria a fair bit, what conclusions do you draw about Russian targeting and capabilities in Syria? Do they pay any attention to civilian casualties? They seem to have hit a lot of hospitals. If you look at the fall of Aleppo, certainly the direct attacks were usually credited to the Russians. Do they care? They seem to be, as I say, rampant violations. Did anybody ever call them on it? I think there's plenty of press on that where people are calling them on that. But by the way, the paradox of precision-guided weapons is, the good news is precision-guided munitions hit their target. The bad news is precision-guided munitions hit their target. And so it's precision-guided munitions are only effective into achieving your strategy if you have the ability to gain intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and then use that intelligence, reconnaissance,
you know, and all that stuff, and put it together in a way that allows you to use those precision guided munitions to effect. I don't, you know, there's been a lot of reports about the targeting that has been done, you know, and I'll leave you to your own conclusion on that. But the only thing I do know is that it took us 20 years for us to get the targeting, the processing, the exploitation, and the distribution of that intelligence to get it to the PhD level that Western coalitions have. They're not there yet, I would argue. It's an enormous investment to get that kind of intelligence and then to put that into the targeting process. I don't know. Like I said, I'll leave that to you. They do hit a lot of hospitals, according to reports. I don't know what else to say. They're either really bad at it or they do it intentionally. I don't really know. But it is the art of executing precise combat power from the air. And you know, as I don't think it's there, but they say they're being careful about it, you know, but even if you take that for their word, they do hit a lot of hospitals, apparently. That's what the reports say.
Listen, we'll take one more here on the front, and then we're going to go to the back, because we've been predominantly kind of clustered here. Rafid, that's...
Thank you, General. I'm Rafid Jabouri, a Jamestown analyst and journalist. You mentioned the no-fly zone Air Force as one of the phases of your career. Do you think that imposing a no-fly zone was going to be the answer in Syria? Because that was the opposition's demand even before the emergence of the red line narrative and everything else.
I don't know if it was the answer or not. I do think it could be done, but you know, I think everybody in here needs to understand, you know, that when you quote impose a no-fly zone, you have to do that with kinetic effect. You know, you're literally attacking radar, missile sites, and all of that kind of stuff. So it's not like a benign activity. Now, whether or not it helps on the ground is the argument. And so that was a decision for our country to make. It was clearly an effective way that we managed Iraq under the authority of the UN sanctions. Remember, we had a no-fly zone in the south to protect the Shiites from their government, and then we had a no-fly zone in the north to protect the Kurds from their government. And it wasn't perfect, but it was an act that was, you know, underpinned by a United Nations Security Council resolution, and we were able to do it. But it was expensive, and it had a long-term consequence effect on our force. So I don't know if it was the answer or not. Single domain responses to political problems are challenging. Let me just put it that way. I would prefer a more joint, you know, kind of effort that would allow for whatever goal we were to achieve. The question that was always missing is, what do you want to achieve on the ground? What did we want to do with the no-fly zone? I don't think that, I don't know if that answer, I don't know if that question ever got answered. So.
Question in the back. Young lady's been waiting.
Hi, Ann Pierce, author. Thank you so much. Learned so much from listening to you. In Syria, as Assad's atrocities got worse and worse and hostilities grew and grew, the U.S. and UN response was mostly to accommodate Assad and to go along with one Russian plan for Syria after another. And it seems that now that Assad, detested Assad, has managed to hold on to power, and Russia is now the power broker in Syria, that people are saying, well, we have to accommodate Assad and go along with Russian plans and cooperate. So it seems that the very thing that got us into this mess now, we're going to do more of. And I just am so curious to get your take on alternatives for U.S.-Syria policy going forward now that things are as bad as they are.
You know, I mean, my opinion is as good as yours. You know, I think that the opportunity to affect what we wanted there is come and gone, to be perfectly honest. And, but I do think, you know, you have to remember we're in uncharted waters. I mean, the one thing that we did have in common is the goal to eliminate these terrorist organizations. And how did we do there? I mean, I think we did pretty well against ISIS. We'll see what happens in the future, but it was, you know, so that was a positive effect that came out of it. Where it goes in the future, I really don't know. What it means for the future of the Assad regime, I don't really know. But I think in the meantime, it's frozen until we come up with a better idea.
Okay, this woman, she's been waiting. Microphone.
Thank you for the presentation. And this would be a question which would follow up the previous question. I have been wondering what would be the human toll and the toll in terms of displacement from the Russia's last 18 years of strategic military actions. And I was wondering whether you have seen any figures, including from Chechnya to Syria, possibly coming through all the Balkan frozen conflicts, the Crimea, Donbass, Lugansk, and all of this. Are we talking here about 5 million people killed and displaced, 10 million people? What would be the toll really?
I mean, you have a pretty good knowledge of the toll. You know, I mean, I think that the millions of people that either left Syria or are displaced in Syria and the damage that has happened in Syria is going to make that a long toll. Remember, there were irritations in Turkey too, you know, among the EU countries with respect to, you know, refugees going into Turkey. I think the last time when I left, it was 3 million people, and then they made an arrangement where the EU would help Turkey cover the expenses of that. But with respect to the long-term damage and the toll, you know, I don't have a good answer for that except to say there's a lot of suffering there. You know, there's a lot of potential, human potential that's not being used. There are more challenges being infused in some of those nations than there are solutions. And I think it's going to be a challenge for a long time.
Just one more question. Do you feel that in Eastern Europe, the US is also losing strategic ground? I have a feeling that in the Balkans, in countries what was previously Central Europe, we are really leaving it much more to Russian political influence and economic influence. It is not as visible as the frozen conflicts, but it's very kind of, you could sense it in the region, especially places like Bosnia, like Bulgaria, like Romania. Do you have a feeling that we are really losing this ground? And do you see that as a long-term loss?
Yeah, and what's your nationality?
I'm Bulgarian.
Bulgarian, yeah. I've been to Bulgaria many times, and Romania. I think the only thing I'll say with that, I don't think we're losing ground there. You know, I think that many of those nations are committed and would prefer, you know, like Poland recently offered $2 billion if there would be a movement of U.S. forces to Poland, et cetera, and all of that. I think they have a long wish list of things that would help to salve over the sense of vulnerability that they feel because of their location. But I think that the nations that you talked about are strong partners in NATO. They share our values. I think they all believe that they could get some of the attention that the Baltic countries get. You know, and then of course, by the way, in the south of Europe, you know, those nations wish they would get more attention from NATO too with respect to the migration. And so I found all of the allies that I worked with were strong believers in NATO. They just believe that the priorities of NATO aren't aren't as good as they could be for their own security. But that's the beauty of being in an alliance. And I thought it was pretty cool when President Obama, after the invasion of Crimea and that annexation, I mean, he went to the Baltics twice to reassure them that we're all in on Article 5. And I thought that was a pretty strong message with respect to our commitment to NATO. And so I think coalitions are tricky. The bottom line is we have to continue to communicate and rationalize priorities and to make sure that in the end we can choose to disagree about our focus, but what we can't choose to undermine one bit is the commitment to deterrence and the commitment to collective defense should deterrence fail.
Question here, this woman been waiting. No, we're on C-SPAN. They want to hear you.
I wonder if you can comment on the extent to which Israel may be collaborating with Russia in the Syrian theater, and how has the U.S. responded to such collaboration, if at all?
I'll be honest, I have absolutely no idea, if that's true or not. So I just don't know the answer to that question.
I want to ask a question that didn't come up today, and that's about Turkey's role in the region. And there is a debate, not a debate, but there's been suggestions raised that we can move Incirlik because of the friction with Turkey and move the base to Erbil. And some have said no, impossible. Is Incirlik irreplaceable? I mean, can we move somewhere else, or is
nothing is irreplaceable if you have enough money.
Is Jordan not? I mean, what's
No, I mean, listen, I'm going to answer that question in a more generic way. Our relationship with the Turks over time has been spectacular. They have been good allies. And, I know there's a lot of controversy going on with Turkey right now, but the bottom line is, Turkey is in NATO, and I think that this is a case where we agree to disagree. But the bottom line is, I think overall our strategic goals are the same. And I loved going to Turkey. I think that the Turkish nation has been very good to NATO, and I think we need to continue to develop and nurture that relationship. Because the reality is it's a very large democratic Muslim country that's in the strongest alliance ever. So it's something worthwhile working at, in my view.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to end on that note. We want to stay on time and on track. So we very much appreciate your comments here on Gorenc, and let's give them a round of applause.